aware, civil servants aren't ivory tower people. Most senior civil servants come from relatively poor backgrounds. That's the truth of the matter. The civil service is very much a place where you get on, you had to do a competition, an exam to get in. It didn't matter who your mommy or daddy was. And once you got in, it was promotional merit. So just a little bit about my own story. I was talking to Katrina earlier on, I said the main difference between Katrina's story and mine is my parents went drug addicts. That's the main difference. I was born and raised in North Inner City, Dublin. I went to school where there was 54 lads in the class. 51 of them ended up in Mountjoy. I was one of them who didn't. The reason I didn't end up in Mountjoy is because, as I said, my parents weren't drug addicts, and my mother in particular placed an awful lot of store in education. And although she was immobile, although she had a profound disability, although I and my sister spent a lot of our time caring for her, so I know what disability is. I know what child caring is. She could do one thing. She made sure we did our homework, and she helped us do that homework, and she told us get educated and get out. So I know, I have a background, I have an understanding, as do an awful lot of other senior civil servants that you speak to them. There's no Secretary General who went to a private school. There's nobody on my management board who went to a private school. The schools we went to were Christian brothers and nuns. So just to be aware that actually we all have stories, and all our stories are powerful, and we are all amazing. Everyone in this room is amazing. Some of us are more amazing than others, and Katrina is definitely the most amazing of all. But listen, don't assume when you sit in your workshops that we don't understand. Don't assume that we don't have our own lived experience. Don't assume that we don't know what it takes to be a carer or what it means to be a person with a disability. There are people on my management board with disabilities, just like people who wonder, are there people in organisations with disabilities? Just to be aware of that. Sometimes when people talk, they're talking in us and them scenario. It's not us and them, it's us together. And it's important to know that. Listen, about the data, there's not a lot I can add to the stories that were already told here today. One thing I will say is, in policy development, we tend to rely on big data. That's what economists do, it's what policy people do, and big data is important. Jerry gave you some of the data, and it shows us part of the story, but it's only part of the story. What it doesn't give us is what people's lived experience is. It doesn't give us the individual stories, and it's the individual stories that matter, because increasingly it's the last yard of progress that we have to make. And you don't do that through big, broad, sweeping steps. You do it through nuanced interventions. The other problem with the data is that it tends to treat the issue of social exclusion as unidimensional, or at most bidimensional. That social exclusion is all about possessions and income. In fact, social exclusion, what I prefer to talk about as social inclusion, is about much more than that. It's about respect, it's about parity of esteem, it's about aspiration, it's about opportunity, and as Katrina put it much more powerfully than I am, it's about love, it's about security, it's about connection. The data doesn't tell us that, but your stories tell us that. And that's what emboldens us and what energises us and what encourages us to go and make the case on your behalf for the changes that need to be made. There's a couple of things about Katrina's story, and a lot of people have spoken about her, right? And I think there's a couple of insights, and I want to repeat them. The first is, and I said it before, we're all amazing. But the thing is, very often we settle. We settle for what society gives us. And if you're in poverty, you'll settle for poverty. Katrina spoke about even her family, her social circle. She was kind of being directed towards, you just get in welfare and get a local authority house and you'll be fine. You're better than that. People are better than that. We're better than that. We should aspire to be better than that as a society and as individuals. And people need to push, and people need to charge, and they need to make their voices heard, and they need to give out to people like me to make it easier for them to get on. So that needs to happen. But the most important insight I think she gave us is that for that to happen for any individual, it's having the right voice in their ear, at the right time, giving them the right support in the right direction. And most of the people in this room, that's what you do. Whether you're in the department, whether you're in an advocacy group or support group, you're the voice in the ear of the people who need help. And I want to recognise that and actually make a difference. That's what you are. In my case, it's my mother. Like, not everyone had the advantage. There were 51 lads went to prison. 20 of them subsequently died of heroin addiction. They didn't have the same voice I had. But you're the voices that can direct other people on to do the things they need to do. The other thing I think I take that you said that's an insight, but it's more than that, it's an absolute fact, is that we have a duty and an interest in making sure that those voices are heard, and that those voices, when they do point people in the right direction, that the people can follow that direction. The example she gave of when I ask the question, I need the answer now and I need the support now, I might only ask it once. That's a very powerful insight. So we have a responsibility. So those of us as service providers and policy advisors, we need to recognise that. And we need to recognise the courage it takes for someone to come forward. The courage it took Katrina, and I spoke to her about this afterwards, in making the decision to try and better herself, and that's what the decision was. She's stepping away from one tribe and saying, you know what, I know everybody's pointing me in the direction of social housing, pointing me in the direction of social welfare, but is that all? Is that it? I want to be a bit more. Taking that step and saying, I want to be more than that. And I want to go to college and I want to get educated. At a time when she couldn't be sure, leaving one tribe behind, that she'd even be accepted in the other tribe. That takes huge courage. And for people like myself in the department, for people like politicians, for people like yourselves, we've got to recognise that courage, and we've got to make sure that we don't put unnecessary barriers in the way of people taking those steps. So the example that Naomi gave, unnecessary barrier, that's part of what this informs us, and I'll respond to it. How can we make our systems and our processes and our approaches better so that somebody takes the brave step, that we don't actually put an unnecessary barrier in the way. It's an example I often give to politicians to talk to me about fraud, and you know, we spend about 3% more in the department every year than we should spend. And that's an awful lot of money. 3% of 27 billion is an awful lot of money. And I say, you know what, we get that 3% down to 1%, but that would make the life of the 97% that we're not overpaying miserable, because the controls we'd have to put in place. So we're not going to do that. And we've got to think, even with that approach, can we take away some of the barriers like Naomi mentioned? Are those things that we can do? So they're the challenges that I take out of it. The other thing I want to say though is that we need to recognise the progress that's been made. Louise, when she spoke, recognised the progress that's been made across lone parent payments and the child maintenance issue, increased income disregards, the differential payment for the child support payment. There have been similar changes over the last years in pensions and carers payments and so on. I think it's important we recognise those, because actually the trend in the data is that Ireland is becoming a better place in which to live. I know every year it spikes up and down a bit, but if I go back to 2010 when I joined the department, even 2014, if I go back to 2014, say 10 years ago, because the last data is 2024, consistent poverty rates have more or less halved. Deprivation rates have more or less halved. Risk of poverty has more or less halved. It's not where we'd like them to be, but the data shows we're getting there. Jerry showed the data compared to the rest of Europe on the ROP rate. We're down the bottom 3 or 4 in terms of risk of poverty. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, it wasn't the case 10 years ago. And some of the changes I've just spoken about and that Louise mentioned are the changes that have helped to make that happen. Hot school meals, free school books, childcare, changes to payment rates. They've all helped. So we need to build on that, not disregard it. We need to build it and see where we go next. You know, as individuals, when we look in the mirror, at least when I look in the mirror, I see my imperfections and flaws, I see the spots. That tends to be the case. We examine ourselves and we see the negatives. But actually, and I know this from sport, the best captain you'll ever have in a sporting team is not the one who balls you out for making a mistake. It's the one who says, listen, you can do better than that, you did it before. And sometimes that's the approach you've got to take to these challenges you've got. Acknowledge the progress you've made and try to build in it. And I think that's something we should do. But in doing that, I'm not arguing we should, or I'm not encouraging or not voting or not promoting any complacency. And there are a couple of things that we need to be particularly aware of, and I've said these before, and you've heard me say these things before, but there's 4 things. The fact that consistent poverty has reduced from nearly 10% to 5% in 6 years is little comfort to the person who's in that 5% group. If you're one of that 5%, your experience of consistent poverty is 100%. The fact that unemployment is at 4%, the lowest rate ever in Ireland, is of little comfort to the person who's one of those 4%. Their experience of unemployment is 4%, is 100%. The averages are great, but they hide the individual stories, and we've got to be aware of that. And we have to remain focused, and if anything, become even more focused on addressing the factors that give rise to the 100% experience of the people that experience poverty, experience exclusion, experience unemployment, who experience discrimination. We need to be focused on that 100%. The second thing is that as we improve the overall metrics and as they get closer to the goals, it gets harder and harder to make the final push. Niall referenced this in some of his answers. I'll use an analogy from the sporting world. In the sporting world, and this is an analogy I've used before, and many of you probably heard me use it, people who are familiar with rugby, and I never didn't go to a rugby playing school, as you can probably guess, but people who are used to rugby, are used to American football, they know the expression, the last yard is the hardest. Getting over the line is the hardest. And that's because as you get closer to the line, you don't have the space to manoeuvre. Big, broad attacks don't work, you've got to be surgical. And that's kind of where we're getting to in Ireland, I think. Getting from 5% down to 2%, big, broad policy strokes probably won't get you there. They need to be more surgical. And this is a personal view, don't say it's a government view, by the way. They need to be more surgical, they need to be more nuanced. They need to target the people that will make a real difference. So that's one of the challenges we've got. The third thing we've got to understand is that it's not all about the money, and it's related to that last point. All the decisions that government have to make involve trade-offs. It's easy at one level to increase social welfare rates, and that's certainly part of the solution. We should continue to increase social welfare rates. And much of the progress that's been made in recent years, and Jerry's figure showed that in terms of the difference between the risk of poverty before social transfers and after social transfers, is due to improvements in social welfare. But we've got to always challenge ourselves, is that the best route, particularly as it becomes more important to be more surgical, more nuanced? Is it better, for example, and I don't take this, I'm just using this as an example, right? Is it better, for example, to increase payments to carers or people with disabilities? Or is it better to give them the services that they need? I don't know the answer to that question. It's probably a bit of both, but what's the balance? Would carers prepare more respite care, more hours a day support? Would they prepare better health care for the person they're caring for? Would they prefer more access to employment and education rather than a higher payment? They'd like all of it, but what's the balance? They're difficult trade-offs, they're difficult decisions. And so that's the kind of decision that we're increasingly facing. The same, you could say the same in housing, by the way. Is it better to increase expenditure on housing supports like HAP, or would it be better to spend the same money building more houses? So, but it's the same kind of trade-off. You've got these trade-offs. So these are the trade-offs. And the very important that we hear your views on this. These are not easy questions. There's no easy answers, but the answers need to be informed, not by the big data, but by the individual stories. And that's where you come in. And to go back to what Katrina said, and this is the fourth point I want to make. Katrina made the point that, social inclusion isn't about the economy. She's right, it's not about the economy. She said it's about love, it's about security, it's about connection. She's absolutely right. I couldn't agree with her more than that. But actually, the fact that social inclusion is about those things doesn't mean that the economy doesn't matter. And in fact, social inclusion is good for the economy. I think I've said it before these sessions, and if anyone hasn't read it, I'd encourage you to go and read it or go onto the website. Some of you, I know in this room, are very familiar with it, the book called The Spirit Level. If you haven't read it, read it. If you can't read or you don't want to read, there's a great website with loads of videos. Effectively what that shows is that, and this is a point we make all the time in the department, expenditure on social inclusion is not a cost, it's an investment. Because the societies and the economies that do best are those that have greater levels of social inclusion and lower levels of inequality. So what we do is not a cost, it's an investment. What you want us to do is not a cost, it's an investment. And we need your stories to give us the energy to continue to make that case, to give us the evidence to continue to make that case. Knowing that we can't answer every story and we can't respond to every need, we can never do that. But that's why the social inclusion forum is important. And that's why the thanks I started off with most of all I want to give to yourselves, the participants in the workshops beforehand, in the sessions today. The thank you for your stories, the thank you for your time. You can be sure that as officials, both within the department and representatives of the departments here, we'll use these and we'll bring them to the information, to the attention of our ministers. You can be sure that as participants, you'll all get a copy of the feedback report. You can be sure, and I've said this about other ministers, and it's the same by the way, I've dealt with a lot of politicians from every part of the political spectrum, and politicians sometimes get a bad rap. I haven't come across a badly motivated politician or a politician who doesn't want to improve life for everybody. Dara Cleary is similarly that type of politician. And you can be sure that he'll use the evidence and the information that we bring to him in his discussions with his government colleagues around the formation of the National Disability Strategy, about the formation of the new pathways or the new roadmap for social inclusion, and about the budget. And very often change doesn't happen quickly. What's the poetic term? We have a writer in the room, the change comes dropping slowly. It does come dropping slowly. Somebody said nothing's changed. Hot school meals was an idea that I first heard at the Social Inclusion Forum. Improved childcare and the need for improved childcare was something I first heard at the Social Inclusion Forum. Doing away with taking the child maintenance payment into account in means tests was at the Social Inclusion Forum. Introducing an option for carers to get better pensions was something that came with the Social Inclusion Forum. They are all things that have happened, and they're all things that have happened in the last 5 years. So don't lose hope. Change does happen, but not all change can happen all together. And so that's why it continues to be important to do these forums, to have them, even if every year there's a bit of repetition. You can expect that. But every year there's something new, and every year something that was previously on the list of things that people might get done is no longer on it because it has been done. So thank you for your time, thank you for your energy, thank you for your commitment, and I wish you all a safe journey home. Thank you very much.